You may also notice that this emptiness feels different from sadness. Sadness has weight, tears, a reason. Emptiness feels light but heavy at the same time, like something is missing, but you can't name what it is. It's the absence of emotion rather than the presence of pain, and because it doesn't hurt sharply, you learn to live with it. This often happens when your life has been shaped more by expectations than by inner desire. You did what was reasonable. You chose what made sense. You followed the path that promised stability, approval, or safety. Somewhere along the way, you stopped asking whether that path actually felt right to you. And when you disconnect from your own desires long enough, the mind doesn't rebel, it goes quiet. You may still feel things on the surface. You laugh, you talk, you react, but those reactions don't sink in, they don't linger. Moments pass through you instead of landing inside you. Even happiness feels temporary and shallow, like it belongs to someone else. And afterward, the emptiness returns unchanged. This kind of emptiness often grows in people who learned early to be emotionally responsible. People who didn't want to cause trouble. People who learned to regulate themselves before anyone taught them how to express themselves. You became good at managing emotions, but not at honoring them. So eventually, your emotional system stopped offering depth, because depth was never welcomed. Another reason this emptiness appears is chronic distraction. Not the obvious kind, but the subtle kind: constant productivity, constant stimulation, constant movement. You stay busy enough to avoid silence, because silence brings questions you don't know how to answer. And when life finally slows down, the emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. You might try to fix it externally. More goals, more achievements, more content, more plans, but emptiness doesn't respond to more. It responds to honesty. And honesty is uncomfortable when you've spent years ignoring your inner world. There's also fear underneath this emptiness. Fear that if you stop and really look inside, you won't like what you find. Fear that you wasted time. Fear that you chose wrong. So instead of listening, you stay numb. Numbness feels safer than regret. But emptiness isn't there to punish you. It's there to get your attention. It's your mind and body telling you that functioning is not the same as living, that being fine is not the same as being fulfilled, that something inside you needs space, not suppression. And the moment you stop judging the emptiness, it starts to change. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly. You begin to notice small feelings returning, a moment of sadness that actually feels real, a moment of curiosity, a moment of longing. These aren't problems, they're signs of reconnection. Emptiness fades when you allow yourself to feel without rushing to label it or fix it. When you let boredom exist long enough to turn into insight. When you let discomfort speak instead of silencing it with distraction. That's when depth returns, quietly, honestly. That emptiness deepens when you realize how long you've been living on autopilot. Days pass, routines repeat, conversations blur together, and nothing feels wrong enough to fix, yet nothing feels right enough to stay. You're not unhappy, but you're not satisfied either. You exist in between, suspended in a life that works but doesn't resonate. This often happens when you've trained yourself to prioritize stability over truth. You chose what was safe instead of what was meaningful. You adapted to what life demanded instead of listening to what you wanted. And over time, your inner voice grew quieter, not because it had nothing to say, but because it learned it wouldn't be heard. Emptiness is what remains when your emotional world has been postponed for too long. When feelings were inconvenient, you delayed them. When desires felt unrealistic, you ignored them. When rest felt undeserved, you avoided it. None of this happened in one dramatic moment. It happened slowly, responsibly, logically. And that's why the emptiness feels so confusing now. You may notice that you feel most empty during moments that are supposed to feel peaceful. Late at night, quiet mornings, pauses between tasks. That's when there's no noise to distract you from yourself. And instead of clarity, you feel blankness. That blankness isn't the absence of self, it's the result of long-term self-avoidance. There's also grief hiding inside this emptiness. Grief for the parts of you that never got attention, the interests you abandoned, the emotions you minimized, the version of yourself that wanted more but learned to settle. This grief doesn't cry loudly. It sits silently, disguised as numbness. You might think the solution is to feel more passion, more motivation, more excitement. But emptiness doesn't heal through intensity. It heals through presence, through slowing down enough to notice what you've been avoiding, through allowing yourself to feel small, unclear, unfinished emotions without immediately escaping them. The hardest part is staying with the emptiness without judging it, without calling it weakness, without rushing to fix it, because emptiness isn't a flaw, it's a transition. It's what you feel when the old way of living no longer fits, but the new way hasn't fully formed yet. And if you let it, emptiness can become a doorway instead of a dead end. You begin to see that emptiness isn't random, it has a history. It's built from years of adapting instead of expressing, coping instead of processing, moving forward instead of checking in. You didn't lose yourself suddenly. You slowly learned how to live without fully being yourself. At first, this adaptation felt like maturity. You stopped reacting. You stopped needing reassurance. You stopped expecting too much. You became efficient with emotions. But emotions aren't meant to be managed like tasks. They're meant to be felt, understood, and released. When they aren't, they don't disappear, they flatten. And that flatness is what you now experience as emptiness. You might notice that you rarely feel deeply disappointed anymore, but you also rarely feel deeply excited. You rarely feel heartbreak, but you also rarely feel real joy. This is the trade-off of emotional numbness. It protects you from pain, but it also protects you from aliveness. And over time, a protected life becomes a distant one. This is why people who feel empty often say, "I don't know what I want anymore." Desire fades when it's ignored long enough. Passion quiets down when it's postponed too many times. Your inner world didn't disappear, it learned to stay silent because silence was safer. You may also realize that you've been living more for outcomes than for experience. Finishing things, achieving things, maintaining things, you're always arriving somewhere. But never really being anywhere. Life feels like preparation for a future that never quite arrives, and the present keeps slipping through your hands. Emptiness shows up to interrupt that pattern. Not to punish you, not to shame you, but to slow you down enough to notice what you've been missing. It asks uncomfortable questions. What have you been avoiding feeling? What parts of yourself did you leave behind to keep life working? What would happen if you stopped functioning for a moment and actually listened? These questions feel heavy because they require honesty, not action. And honesty feels risky when you've built your life on control and stability. But emptiness doesn't demand immediate answers. It only asks that you stop running from the questions. And the moment you do that, even slightly, the emptiness begins to shift. As you sit with that emptiness instead of trying to escape it, you may notice something unexpected. It isn't completely empty after all. Beneath the numbness there are faint signals, a quiet tiredness, a subtle longing, a feeling that something in you wants attention, not achievement. These signals were always there, but they were drowned out by responsibility, distraction, and the pressure to keep life fine. This is where emptiness starts transforming from a void into a message. It tells you that you've been living in a way that keeps things stable, but not meaningful. That your days are full, but your inner world is undernourished. You didn't lose passion because you're lazy or broken. You lost it because it was never given space to breathe. You begin to realize that feeling empty is often the cost of being emotionally unavailable to yourself. You showed up for tasks, roles, and expectations, but not for your inner experiences. You listened to what needed to be done, but ignored what needed to be felt. And over time, that internal neglect created distance, not from life, but from yourself. When people say life is fine, what they often mean is that nothing is wrong enough to justify stopping. But healing doesn't wait for disasters. It begins when you notice quiet discomfort and choose to listen instead of dismissing it. Emptiness is one of the earliest signs that something inside you wants a different kind of attention, slower, deeper, more honest. You may feel tempted to fill this space immediately, with goals, with noise, with improvement, but emptiness doesn't want to be filled, it wants to be understood. It wants you to ask questions you've been avoiding. It wants you to reconnect with parts of yourself that were postponed for practicality, safety, or approval. And this reconnection doesn't happen through dramatic change. It happens through small permission, letting yourself feel bored without judging it, letting sadness exist without rushing to fix it, letting desires resurface without immediately calling them unrealistic. These moments may feel insignificant, but they slowly restore depth to your inner world. As this depth returns, life doesn't suddenly become exciting, it becomes real. Moments land again, emotions have texture. You feel more, not in an overwhelming way, but in an honest one. And with that honesty, emptiness starts losing its grip. And as meaning begins to rebuild, you start noticing changes that are subtle but important. You don't suddenly feel motivated or inspired all the time. Instead, you feel present. Ordinary moments stop slipping past you unnoticed. A quiet morning feels quiet instead of empty. A pause in your day feels like space instead of nothingness. You begin to understand that emptiness was never asking you to add more to your life. It was asking you to remove the distance between you and yourself. To stop living only from the outside, roles, routines, responsibilities, and start including your inner experience again, even when it feels unclear or uncomfortable. This is where many people get confused. They expect healing to feel uplifting, but at first it feels honest. You may feel sadness you avoided for years. You may feel regret or anger or grief for time lost. This doesn't mean emptiness is getting worse. It means numbness is wearing off. Feeling again is part of coming back to life. You also begin to notice how often you abandoned yourself in small ways, saying yes when you meant no, staying busy to avoid thinking, minimizing your own emotions because they felt inconvenient. None of this makes you weak, it makes you human. You did what you had to do to get through. Emptiness is simply the moment your system says, we're safe enough now to feel again. Slowly, your inner world starts to regain color. Not bright at first, muted, gentle, imperfect, but real. You start recognizing what drains you and what restores you. You stop chasing fulfillment and start paying attention to resonance, what feels aligned, what feels forced. And this is the shift that changes everything. You stop asking, why do I feel empty? And start asking, what have I been disconnected from? That question doesn't shame you, it guides you. It turns emptiness from a problem into a signal, one that points you back toward yourself. Life doesn't become extraordinary overnight, but it becomes inhabited. You're no longer just moving through it, you're inside it, feeling it, responding to it. And that's when emptiness loses its power, not because it disappears completely, but because it's no longer ignored. Because emptiness was never the absence of life. It was the absence of you in your own life, and at the end of this realization, you stop fighting the emptiness. You stop treating it like a flaw that needs to be fixed and start seeing it as a message that needed to be heard. Life was never empty, you were just absent from parts of it. Not intentionally, not carelessly, but gradually, while trying to be responsible, stable, and fine. You understand now that feeling empty wasn't a sign that something was wrong with you. It was a sign that something inside you had been waiting to be acknowledged, felt, and included again. You weren't disconnected because you failed at life. You were disconnected because you learned how to survive without fully engaging. And survival, when it lasts too long, becomes numbness. When you begin showing up for yourself, even imperfectly, life doesn't suddenly make sense, but it starts to feel closer. You stop chasing meaning as an idea and start experiencing it in moments, in honesty, in presence, in allowing yourself to feel without judging what shows up. The emptiness doesn't vanish forever. Sometimes it returns quietly, reminding you to slow down, to check in, to come back to yourself. And this time you don't panic, you listen, because you know now what it's asking for. Not more success. Not more distractions. Not a different life. Just you, fully present in the one you're already living. And when you're there, even briefly, life stops feeling empty, even when it's simple, quiet, and imperfect. It starts feeling real.